All right, I want to continue talking about classes, and in this video, I want to talk about the idea of the scope of instance variables. So we've talked about scope before in the sense of, for example, this parameter name, initial radius, can be used in the scope of the method, and if there are other local variables declared, they have scope in that method. So an instance variable, like radius here, has scope within its class. Well, it goes all the way to the bottom here. So when we look at something like radius, of course, this does look a little funny for a while, right? We're used to looking at a method, and this variable name has to be either a parameter, something defined up there, or a local variable like this, or well, that's it, right? And all of a sudden we have this thing that we don't see where it is declared, or even really how it's initialized. And so where does it come from? Well, it comes from the class itself. So there are these things now that have like a little larger scope throughout the class. And let me also suggest that you shouldn't abuse that. In other words, don't start making private or even public int index that you're going to use in for loops or something like that. All right, you just declare it once up here, then use it in a bunch of for loops throughout your code. That's not the point of that. The instance variables should be things that reflect the internal state of the object. In other words, data that's important to define, like what a circle is, not some side thing like I'm going to count up to 100 in a loop somewhere. All right, so don't just start sprinkling these in here to just avoid passing as parameters or doing other kinds of things. So normally we can't have two variables in the same scope. Well, let me go to a place where there's a here. So let me go int new radius equals 3, and it's going to complain about that because this is a duplicate name, new radius, as the parameter, which has scope in this instance method. So you're not allowed to do that. Now the weird thing is that you are allowed to do something that seems sort of similar. Okay, so here I have a parameter called radius, and I have an instance variable radius, and what happens is local variables, including the parameters, can have the same name as instance variables, but these local ones do what's called shadow the instance variable. In other words, this radius here is resolved to this parameter. At this point, neither of these radius names go to the instance variable, right? So this actually is now meaningless. This says, to this parameter radius, assign itself. And I think it's going to maybe say something, if I hover, the assignment to variable radius has no effect. So it's basically saying you're assigning it to yourself, and so that this doesn't mean anything. All right, now the problem is that these are kind of nice. We like the name radius here, and we like the name radius as an instance variable, and is there some way to clarify which one we mean here? And there is a keyword, this, that means the object that calls a method. All right, so what does all this mean? Well, let's go down. Where should I do this? I'm gonna put this in front of here. So what radius is this? It belongs to the object that called the set radius method. Well, what does that mean? Well, here I'm going to take circle and call set radius with a 5. Okay, so now there is an object, a circle object, that is calling this instance method, or invoking, we could say sometimes. So circle calls this method. When we're in set radius, how does this code know which radius this belongs to, right? So if we have 5 circles, each has their own radius. So what does it mean? How do we know which one it belongs to? Well, it is the object that called this method that owns this radius instance variable. And we can actually make this explicit by putting this dot in front of it. Normally that would be an object of some kind that that goes before the instance variable with the dot notation. And in this case, this refers to the object that called this method. So in this particular code, when I call it with circle, and I'm running this method, then this also refers to that circle object. If it were circle 5 that had called the method, then this would refer to the circle 5 object, right? It keeps track of which one called the method. Now, the reason that this is sometimes is nice is that I can, for example, have a parameter here called radius, and I can have that assigned to this dot radius. And in this case, those are two separate things now. This radius, as you can see from the highlighting, resolves to this parameter. This radius resolves to the instance variable that is part of the class. And so that's kind of convenient. Like, you don't have to make up some dumb name like beginning radius value or something like that here. You can say, this is the radius, and I'm going to assign it to the instance variable radius. Now, there's a question of how often this should be used. Like, should you use it everywhere? And some people like that. They want to say, hey, I get confused about knowing where radius comes from, and so if I put this in front of it, I know it's an instance variable, and I know to look up top and see what kind of thing it is. I would say this is not not dominant style. Another approach is to use it in a situation where there is a conflict. Well, you have to use it where there's a conflict, basically. But if there's a chance of shadowing, if the local variable is shadowing the instance variable, then you use this in there. Other people say you should never really use this. You should just make sure these variable names aren't the same. I think you'll see examples of all the styles of code, and you'll have to figure out which one you like. I prefer not to have this in front of everything, although, for example, Python, they use a similar thing, self dot, for this, and you are forced to use self dot in front of everything. And I do find that kind of convenient sometimes. But in Java, I think the tendency is to not require that every time. It's certainly not you're not required to from the language, but the style is that you also don't do it necessarily. All right, this is a very important concept. It's hard to say this, The key word this is a very important concept. It means the object that called the method when you're in that code. All right, thanks.